Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is the Vietnam War, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. So in the last video, you learned about this president, Lyndon B Johnson. And Johnson is a controversial figure in U.S. history. A lot of people praise him for his great society programs, but many others criticize him for his role in the Vietnam War, which you're going to learn about in this video. Let's start by going back and reviewing the context of the Cold War. The Cold War was the ideological battle between the US and the Soviet Union after World War II. Everything you've learned about in this unit, like the Civil Rights Movement, other social justice movements, and Johnson's Great Society, they all occurred while the Cold War was going on. And you also learned earlier about the domino theory and containment, the idea that the US needed to interfere in countries around the world in order to stop the spread of communism. In the last unit, you saw how the US got involved in Korea with the Korean War, and in Germany with the Berlin Airlift, and in Cuba with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then in the 1960s, the US got involved in another country that was threatened by communism, and that country was Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a war fought by the communist North Vietnamese and the capitalist South Vietnamese. This war lasted for a very long time, between 1954 and 1975. It was a proxy war where the Soviet Union supported the North Vietnamese, the communists, and the US supported the South Vietnamese, the capitalists. All right, now let's look at some reasons why the US got involved in this faraway war. The first reason was containment, which meant that the US wanted to stop the spread of communism even in faraway places. At least that was the government's justification for the war. But a more important reason, although not the one that the government admitted, was that the US wanted access to Vietnam's natural resources, especially rubber. Until the 1950s, Vietnam had been a colony of the French, producing rubber for export to the US and to Europe. And the US feared that if communists took control, American businesses would lose access to these precious resources. And the last reason is called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and that's when, in 1964, the US government claimed that a North Vietnamese ship had attacked a US Navy ship without provocation. Without provocation means that the US did nothing to provoke or cause the attack. Anyway, that's what LBJ and the US government claimed, and they used this attack to justify further involvement in Vietnam. But Johnson's claim that the attack was unprovoked was later proved false, and you'll learn more about that in class. For now, know that after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson asked Congress to pass a law allowing the US to increase its military involvement in Vietnam, and Congress agreed, and the law that they passed was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. For most of the Vietnam War, the US had provided mostly just money and weapons, but not soldiers. But the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution led to a huge increase in the number of US soldiers that were deployed to Vietnam. And in this graph, you can see that the number of US soldiers in Vietnam increased dramatically after 1964, which is when the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed. America's enemy in the Vietnam War was the North Vietnamese, as well as communist rebels in South Vietnam who were called the Viet Cong. And in this battle between the world's most powerful country, the US, and one of the world's poorest countries, Vietnam, the powerful country lost. How did this happen? Why was the US unable to win the Vietnam War? One reason was that the US was badly prepared for guerrilla warfare, which is a form of war fought by unofficial soldiers using unconventional tactics. In guerrilla warfare, soldiers do not wear uniforms, they do not use heavy weaponry, and they do not fight in large groups. And because the Viet Cong guerrillas didn't wear uniforms, they blended into the general population, which made it very difficult for US soldiers to identify their enemy. You can see some of the Viet Cong guerrillas in this picture here. The guerrillas often moved in hidden tunnels, like the ones you see in this picture, and they set booby traps in unexpected places, or they used surprise attacks to ambush US troops. Also, the tropical climate of Vietnam was difficult for US soldiers, and its jungles provided easy cover for guerrillas. In order to deal with guerrilla warfare, the US military resorted to brutal tactics that were widely unpopular among soldiers and among the American public. For example, US airplanes dropped 7 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, killing 1.5 million Vietnamese civilians. And to prevent guerrillas from hiding in the jungle, the US dropped 20 million gallons of defoliants, toxic chemicals that cause trees to lose their leaves. The most infamous defoliant, Agent Orange, was responsible for cancer, birth defects, rashes, and severe psychological and neurological problems among the Vietnamese population. These tactics contributed to a large and ultimately successful movement to pressure the US government to end the war. That movement was called the Anti-War Movement, and you'll learn more about it in class. Alright, it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know the answer to any of them, just rewind the video and look again. And I will see you in class. Bye, students.